as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and that's where we are sitting right now, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they have a threefold question. When will this happen? He had just referred to the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. They must have been totally shocked because they were totally convinced that his coming would lead to the kingdom of peace and righteousness from Jerusalem all over the world. And suddenly he says, the city will be destroyed, the temple will be destroyed. And so the question is, when will this happen? Second question is, how do we know that you are coming? This shock made them realize that this coming of Jesus, this entering into the city, would not lead to the kingdom of peace and righteousness from Jerusalem. So if not now, when will it come? That great kingdom from Jerusalem. What are the signs of your coming? They understand that there will be a second coming, a coming in glory. But how do we know? What is the sign that we're almost there? The sign of your coming. Third question, and the end of the age. Some translations have the end of the world, but it's not the end of the world, it's the end of the age. Their question is, when is this terrible phase, this part of world history finally over? With all the suffering and death and killings and hunger and contagious diseases and earthquakes and so forth. When is it finally over? When will you come? And when will the next part of world history begin? The beautiful kingdom of peace and righteousness. Now, we have to understand what went before this. Jesus had just entered into Jerusalem. By the way, Jesus was very popular among the Jews. You hear so often people say, yeah, the Jews rejected him and he was very popular. Most of the time he went through Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, doing the miracles, the signs of the kingdom. But now finally he is going to Jerusalem, and so the rumor spreads he's coming. Now, right before this, he did another sign of the kingdom. He rose Lazarus from the dead. And Lazarus was dead for 4 days. There was a stench near the grave. And he speaks as God spoke in the beginning, let there be, and there was. Jesus says, Lazarus, he spoke, come out. And there he comes. With all the power, the creative power of the word. He spoke, and it happened. And then this rumor spread among the people. He has started to bring in the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of the righteous dead. And when that's like the final proof we need for him to be the true Messiah. Everybody knew he was from the line of King David. Before he enters, there's Bartimaeus, the blind man. And when he hears that Jesus is coming, he starts to shout, Son of David, have mercy upon me. They all knew he was from the line of King David. And the king over Israel should come from the line of King David. He had shown his special relationship with Almighty God, with all these signs and wonders and miracles, signs of the kingdom to come. But now he is given the proof of this bodily resurrection of the righteous dead, of Lazarus. They don't need any more. They're absolutely convinced he's coming. He will now judge the ungodly nations. He will chase the Romans out of the country. And then from Jerusalem, peace will flow into the whole world. He'll be the king. It's wonderful how they welcome him. So the Jews didn't hate Jesus. He was very popular. Blessed be the great son of David. Blessed be the king of Israel. Peace on earth. Finally, it's going to happen. And then he says, the temple will be destroyed. The city will be destroyed. Lord, it's the center of your kingdom. Jerusalem, the center of the earth. The temple where the holy presence of God will be, living among his people. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He's weeping when he's entering the city. If only you could see what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden for your eyes. You're totally enthusiastic, but you don't see because it's hidden from your eyes. And when something is hidden from your eyes, you cannot see. So then, on the Mount of Olives, looking at the beautiful city, looking at the great temple, they asked the threefold question: when will the destruction happen? And it happened 40 years later. Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead around the year 30. 40 years later, in the year 70, the Romans came and destroyed the city of the temple. The great prophet knew what was going to happen. So that's question number one. When will this happen? It happened 40 years later. There's, by the way, a difference between this sermon on the Mount of Olives about the signs of the times in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Luke picks up that the city will be surrounded by hostile armies, that it will fall, that the Jews will be taken into the whole world in captivity. In the book of Matthew, he looks further. Matthew starts to understand that he's not speaking that much about Jerusalem 40 years later, but he sees another Jerusalem in the far distant future. And he's starting to talk about that. He's talking about today and what would happen today. Because the question is, what is the sign of your coming? When will you come back in glory? When will your great kingdom of peace and righteousness finally come? And then he gives the answer, mentioning all the signs of the times. But also, again, speaking about Jerusalem. We look at the place, the Temple Mount, where once the temple stood, but it was destroyed, as you now know. But there's standing something else. He says in Matthew 24, in verse 14 and 15, in verse 15 he talks about an abomination that causes desolation standing in the holy place. Now what does he mean by that? What will be standing in the holy place? An abomination that causes desolation. Some say, well, there will be another temple here on Mount Zion, which is, by the way, Mount Moriah, where Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. What is standing on that holy place? Mount Moriah, Mount Zion, is where Solomon built the temple. You can read it in 1 Chronicles 3. It's two names for the same place. There it says that Solomon built the temple on Mount Moriah, identifying Mount Moriah, where the sacrifice almost happened of Isaac, with Mount Zion. So the holy place could mean two things. It can mean the temple, or it can mean the place upon which the temple was built. The holy place. So some say, well, there will be another temple, and then Antichrist will come and will sit in the temple, showing himself to be divine, like a god. Who am I to say I don't think so? But I really don't think so. Because when you believe that, then you are starting to wait, not expecting the coming of the Lord, but expecting the coming of a temple, in which the Antichrist must sit first, before he can come and destroy him. I think what he means, on the holy place, on the mountain on which the temple was built, something will be there which is an abomination that causes desolation. Now what you see behind you, the Golden Dome, the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Omar's Mosque. They even dug out a third mosque within the Temple Mount. It's already there for centuries. An abomination that causes desolation. It's not something to be expected to come in the future. It's there. And instead of this mountain containing God's temple to bless the world, there's a continuous stream of hatred being preached from this holy place. It's occupied territory by other powers than the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is standing on the holy place. And so you have the Al-Aqsa brigades, suicide bombers. You have the so-called martyrs who try to kill as many Jews as possible. There's a preaching of hatred and killing coming from this place, instead of a comforting message of the God of Israel, who's a God of love and who's a God of life and not of killing and death. So when we are standing here and sitting on the Mount of Olives, we can now fully understand the implication of Jesus' words. The question was, what is the sign of your coming? Now we live in the day and age that there's something standing on the holy place. We live in the day and age that all these signs of the times that Jesus is referring to in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21 and in Mark 13 and the parallel passages, we see a world around us. We know about the disasters. We know about the wars. Well, there have been wars throughout the centuries, but we have just entered a phase of history, leaving the 20th century with even 2 world wars. So the signs of the times, when you put them on statistics, it's steeply on the rise. 2 world wars, with more casualties than in all the previous wars of all the previous centuries, even combined. Millions and millions of mass killings. There have always been earthquakes. But when you listen to the news and you see what's happening in the world, there's almost every day a quake. The number of killer quakes, as they call them, with a lot of casualties, that statistic is steeply on the rise. Contagious diseases, well, we know all about it, and so forth, but also the falling away from the faith, the lawlessness, even the families, the younger generation, standing up against the older generation, even betraying their parents if necessary. It's as if all God's institutions are more and more neglected, of his commandments are shoved aside. So that means what he is speaking about, we see happen in our age. But we see two more things. He said in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. Then this part of world history will finally be over. Now, when I was young, I'm still young, but I was a little bit younger. I was a little bit younger then I thought, well, when the last missionary reached the farthest tribe, I'm long gone. I don't have to worry about the coming of the Lord and the judgment and whatever. I'm fine. Until our eldest daughter went into the mission field. She was a missionary in Kazakhstan for many years, and which is a Muslim society, of course. And then she came to certain villages and she found some Christians there. She said, and then I asked the people who was the missionary here. And they said there was no missionary. But we listened to the radio. And in our Kazakh language and in Russian, they told us about Jesus. And that totally changed our lives. And then I suddenly realized it's happening. Satellites, radio, television, internet, social media, you name it, even by your telephones. Messages about Jesus Christ, the coming of the kingdom, etc. They're there hundreds of hours each day. They are there in practically all the languages of the world. So what Jesus is speaking about is happening today. We don't have to wait till the last missionary reached the furthest tribe. It is happening today. It doesn't say that every individual will hear the gospel of the kingdom. No, the nations will be able to tap into the message. And that's happening. He says when that's happening, then this part of world history will come to an end. And he mentions a second thing. He says, watch the fig tree, which is one of the pictures of Israel. He says, when you see that tree seemingly totally dead, like the valley of dry bones. By the way, when you start reading Ezekiel, you have a great outline of end-time events, starting in Ezekiel 36 about the country, the trees, prepared for the coming of Israel. Then you have the valley of dry bones. And you see that the prophecy says, stand upon your feet and go to the land of Israel. In the second part of Ezekiel 37, you see the two pieces of wood by the prophet held together, the coming together of the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. Then Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog, 38, 39. And then at the end of 39, the question is, will all the Jews come back to Israel before Jesus is coming in glory? The final verse of chapter 39 of Ezekiel says, I will leave no one behind. So ultimately, all will come back to the promised land. We see the start of it. But one day all will come back. It is not clear in my mind, in the scriptures, who will come back before his coming in glory and who will be brought back after that he had come in glory. But the beginning of redemption, as we heard, is already there. They're returning, wave after wave after wave, coming from their worldwide Roman captivity. Kun, Ira, the team, Ukraine, helping them to flee the war zones of Ukraine and Russia. So we see the coming back to life of the Jewish people returning to the land. But Ezekiel 36 clearly teaches that there will be national restoration first, but blind and deaf. They come back from the north and the south and the east and the west, out of the whole world, from the Middle East, the Far East, from the north, Russia, the former Soviet republics, from the south, Africa, from the west, meaning from Europe, from North and South America, blind and deaf. It's what we see happening, blind and deaf. We experience it even. That we had this conversation with our great friend Benjamin. You can say whatever you like, only he who gave the blindness is the one who can take away the blindness. And one day he will, because that's why he's bringing them back to the land. Jesus wants to meet them there, here. He's coming in glory. Well, I'm glad that you're sitting safe here, because when he comes back in glory, where will his feet stand? On the Mount of Olives. What will happen to the mount? It will split in two. There will be a big valley running from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, but there will be the temple. We're almost there. It's wonderful to see all this from this place and to understand it's happening. We're finally almost there. They are returning. There will come the great moment that he will take the blindness and the deafness away. Zechariah 12:10-14. And then we'll see him come riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. And of his kingdom there shall be no end, just as the angel Gabriel promised to his mother Mary. Here Jesus died on the cross. And John witnessed how the spear of the Romans penetrated him. Here he rose from the dead. The garden tomb, empty. He's not there because he's risen. He's alive and well. If he liked to do it, he could simply cross over from the heavenly dimensions into our earthly dimension, as he did for 40 days before the ascension, and he could take a seat among you on this place. He's alive, he's bodily alive. And so it's wonderful to realize all that. And that's why Israel is the greatest sign of hope that the world has ever seen. We see the powers of darkness on the rise. We see the signs of the times being more and more fulfilled, the statistics steeply on the rise. But we also see the restoration of Israel. God is in a great restoration process. He's restoring the land. He's restoring the people to the land. He's restoring the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem that never has been divided in her over 3,000 years of history. Only for 19 years, when it was occupied by the Jordanian troops from 1948 until the Israeli army could liberate that part of the city as well. Occupied territory. And I think that mountain, Mount Zion, is occupied territory as well. Because Jesus says it will be trodden under the feet of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are over. And some say, well, that happened in 67 when Jerusalem was liberated by the Israeli armies. But what makes Jerusalem into Jerusalem? It's that holy place. It's the place where God says, my holy name will dwell there. But God's holy name is not dwelling there yet. The Shekinah glory left the temple. And then the Babylonians. And where did the Shekinah glory come? He went to the east, to the Mount of Olives, to where we are sitting here. From where did Jesus go to heaven? From the Mount of Olives. What came there? The cloud, covering the holy presence of God, the Shekinah glory, as the cloud dwelt in the time that Israel went through the desert. God living in the tabernacle among his people. That cloud that came down when Solomon dedicated his temple. But he left the temple to the Mount of Olives. But one day he will come back. Ezekiel sees it happen, that the glory of the Lord in the final temple, and I'm not talking about the third temple or the fourth temple, but about the final temple. And you read in Ezekiel 43 how the glory of the Lord is returning. Then the man, that's the person, the angelic being who gave Ezekiel the visions and showed him the invisible world, the holy presence of God. Then the man brought me to the gate facing east. There you have him, the gate facing east. And I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. He had departed to the east, and he will come back from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city. And like the visions I had seen by the Kebar River, when he for the first time sees the cherubim and the seraphim and the throne wagon of God and the wheels and the eyes and all these wonderful things. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I fell face down. When he sees the glory of the Lord, he fell face down. It always happens. When the great men of old who got the revelation and saw the glory of God, they did only one thing. They put their face to the ground, spread on the ground. I fell face down, and then the glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. So there will be a temple. And the glory of the Lord will enter into that final temple. The glory of the Lord has not returned to the second temple. There was no Ark of the Covenant in the second temple. But in the final temple, the glory of the Lord will come back to live among Israel. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court of the temple. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. He said, "Son of man," this is God speaking, the Holy One, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place for the soles of my feet. The soles of the heathens of the Gentiles have trodden upon Jerusalem. But he says, this is now the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. Forever. The house of Israel will never again defile my holy name." So we are moving towards this incredible event. We see the preparations for the coming of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. When he came in for the first time, and when he was weeping, then right before this passage in Matthew 24, he says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" They had just said it. Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. He says, he doesn't say you will never see me again. He says you will only see me again when you say, until you say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord."